Hey everyone, welcome to Encounter Grace. I'm Jason McKnight, and I've got here with me Ben Hendricks. As always, Ben, good to be with you.
As always, it is.
And the inimitable Justin Tillman. Justin, we're glad you're here.
I have to look that word up.
Yeah, I'm making them up as I go along. But guys, it smells a little bit like woodworking in here.
It does. It smells really good.
If you're watching online, you can see that the background is a little bit different. The table's a little bit different. If you're listening, you may not automatically know the table and the background are different, but we have to give a shout out to Garrett Lanier locally here, who has done a great job of putting together a new set for us to give us a little fresh thing. I think we're 140 or 145 episodes, and it was just time to get something new.
Well, it looks good.
And better a set than the hosts.
Wow. I guess he's our sponsor today, right? This episode is brought to you by Lanier Woodworking.
Lanier Woodworking.
You never find a better woodworker than a Lanier Woodworker.
And Garrett does good work. I'm just telling you, we appreciate it. Shout out to Garrett and Caroline. They're fun. We had fun dedicating little Stevie the other day at church. Okay, so if you have clicked on this episode, you want to know a little bit about this book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I'm just going to read 4 lines from the inside flyleaf, and then I'm going to admit to something which you guys know, but everyone out there is about to know after I read these lines. After more than a decade of stability or improvement, the mental health of adolescents plunged in the early 2010s. Rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide rose sharply, more than doubling on many measures. ... Why? And that was what led Jonathan Haidt into researching and writing this book called The Anxious Generation, which came out this year, 2024. And we are going to talk about that today. We're going to unpack from the book truths and helps and patterns and trends that describe this. Now, here's the admission. I haven't read the book, but I'm in the middle of these two guys who've read and thought about it and watched it. Ben, you are the first one in our staff, I think, to read it, and you said this is very helpful, and we need to do a podcast on it. Parents need to hear this. Other leaders need to hear this, so on and so forth. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
I've never said any of those things, Jason. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm actually patient zero here, I think. I've infected all of you with,
And then
Haidtism.
And then Justin, you with the side of how the Lord has led your ministry in dealing with folks with anxiety through coaching, life coaching, and some counseling and so forth. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily kids only, or not necessarily kids at all, but here you are dealing, and in your different ministries, you have a lot of that. So I just thought we'd see about getting you guys talking about this book. So because I haven't read it, just pretend I'm representative of our whole audience, our whole listening community, which is very sad for them. But what is this book about? What's going on? Who's first?
Well, I think
we'll let patient zero go first.
Yeah, before we even jump in, here, let me say a couple of things. One, yeah, this is one of those things that I read several months ago, and I was around several of our parents, and I told them straight up, I was like, look, this is one of those books that I was about ready to cash in all of my relational chips on and just say, read the book. Because this is one of those things that I think is very helpful, and it addresses the elephant in the room that we all know is there, but we don't quite know how to deal with, and we're not quite sure if it's bad enough to have to pay the cost to deal with it. And we all have things like that in our lives. That kind of tension that we just have to manage with so many things, specifically with our kids or even ourselves. And so what I love about this is, as we've over the last several years kind of sat down and waited for some of the stats or the results to come in from studies of going, okay, how bad is this phone thing? How bad is this social media thing? Or is it good? Because there's some good, there's some bad, and we get kind of stuck in a no man's land of, well, do I act? Do I not? Because I don't want my child to be the only one, or all of the things that go with that. We kind of sit there and we don't know what to do with it. It's kind of the paralysis by analysis, right? And I think if that's where you are, that is so fair. But what I love about this book and why I've pushed so many parents to read it, and why I think we just need to be talking about it, is because this is the reminder that the results are in. Like, we are no longer in a place of mystery and waiting for to figure out how this social experiment is going to go. We know it. And that's kind of the entire premise of his book, right? That he points out very early in the chapters that in the mid 2010s, there was it marks a sharp increase in mental health struggles. And so he also very specifically mentions that it was particularly for girls too. Yeah. And that he attributes this largely to the introduction of smartphones and the rise of social media around 2012. And so let me mention that as being, I think this is a very important topic. So if you're like kind of barely hanging in there, keep hanging in there. But here's one of the reasons why we should listen to him, because it's not just a great topic to discuss, but he's also a great person to discuss it, because Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist who studied this and studied around these kind of things for decades. And he specifically in the last, 5 to 10 years really wanted to see, was looking at this great problem that he didn't have a solution for, and says, hey, I want to pour in time to look at this. And so he's not kind of recreate the wheel here.
Yeah.
He's not just been like, how do I fix my own kid? He's seen a problem and he walks you through how more or less he's come to that solution. And so it's one of those things where it's like, you kind of read the book and you feel a little seen. You're like, I've wondered about that. I've wrestled with that. And I find this such a helpful book that's full of statistics, but it's also, he meets you kind of where you are. So as we were just talking about, and I'm sure you'll be glad to, listen to us talk about that, Jason. The real premise of this is that in 2010, that Jonathan Haidt was looking at, where does this major drop off or this major problem and the rise of anxiety and depression, specifically and mostly in adolescent girls, but still absolutely true in adolescent boys. Why has this happened? Why are we seeing this now? Why have we seen so many people now in the 2020s, so many young men and young women who with massive rises in suicide, anxiety, depression, and struggles with relationships in community? Why are we seeing that? Yeah. And so there's been so many posited answers to that great question, that pretty much that question that everybody's seeing.
I think it's Trump's fault.
Well,
no, I'm just kidding.
And so he looks at that question and he kind of traces it back to the single year of 2010. And so it's like, well, why is that? I mean, what? And so we can kind of think of what came out in 2010. Any ideas?
Social media.
Yeah. The major influence of social media, right?
Was it Instagram, I think, came around that time? Or that's
and then Facebook was a little bit earlier. Yeah. It was right when they bought them, and they kind of, it was Instagram for the people, right? It was kind of a niche, and then Facebook bought them, and then it goes viral and goes everywhere. I also love that we've actually mentioned this book before. It was one of the very first podcasts we ever did, so you'll have to scroll way down to find it. But Jason and I actually looked at this book by Gene Twenge called who was the author of this book called iGen, which references the I generation, really the generation that grew up their entire lives with an iPhone. So it's really 2008 and on. So if your child was born after or around 2008 and on, they are in iGen, right? And so what they noticed, just as she was noticing, is that the rate of depressive symptoms among 12 to 17-year-old girls increased by, this is wild, 62% between 2010 and 2020. This is an isolated thing to that we see that spike on. And so the problem here is absolutely real. And so it's one that I think we need to address, just as Jonathan Haidt is saying.
Yeah, and so he's also one of the co-authors of Coddling the American Mind, which I know you did a podcast on not too long ago, or maybe it was a long time ago. But a lot of folks that listen to this have probably read that book or listened to that podcast. And what I appreciate about Haidt is he's not just crying wolf. I mean, kind of like you were saying earlier. This is a guy who he doesn't have a religious agenda. He doesn't have a political agenda. He's just saying, hey, here's the data. Here's what it says, and it is what it is. And I got that really from when I first read Coddling of the American Mind, but that's one thing I really appreciate about this book is, like you said, the data's in. And it's hard. It's a hard book to read. I mean, because you start to look at the graphs, you look at the data, and it's like, man, we really are in a mess. But I appreciate how he unpacks, this is how we got here, and here's the data to prove it. I'm not just making this up. Here's the data to prove it. And he's fair enough to say, I'm not saying there aren't other factors at play, but we can definitely see that this is one of the main issues that's driving this mental health crisis in this age group. But that he also comes with solutions, and I know we'll talk about that a little as we move further through. But it's a bleak picture, but I love how he doesn't leave it
right
there.
So the problem or the issue at play is the rise of social media, the rise of smartphones, screens in your hands, and constant connectivity. It's causing anxiety and depression. Why? What is it about the screen in my hand, or if I'm a 13-year-old girl or a 13-year-old boy or whatever? What is it that's changing us? And I know that's what he talks about, but let's begin to put that on the table as we're looking at
so
this.
That age group is that around that time when you see like 12 to 15-year-old, that's when your mind starts to step into the growth realm of identity. And, up until that point, your identity is really built off of your family and that environment. But as you start to get into this teenage span, the focus becomes, all right, who are my people? Which is why peer pressure is so strong in that age group. And
and why parents who lean into relationship can become my people.
Yes.
In a kid's growing world.
Exactly.
But they're not the only people they are
and
with a toddler.
this stuff, social media, the Instagram, Facebook, social media as we know it today. I mean, I remember when Facebook first came out, and it was you had to be a college student to get access to it and all of that stuff. But now, as we know it today, where it's really free reign to anybody, it's hitting at that time frame in their emotional and mental development is, well, who am I? And where do I fit in? And who are my people? Where do I belong? Do I have a sense of purpose? Do I have a sense of identity? And so if that's where you are, and this is the environment you're swimming in, because this is now how you connect to people. You connect first and foremost online. It's almost like perfectly timed to impact what your mind is trying to do anyways, which is develop that sense of identity. Who am I?
Yeah.
Well, and so to answer that, I mean, there's a really cool story towards the beginning of the book that he mentions about a girl named Emma. And so he talks about that this is a 15-year-old who's experienced some severe anxiety and depression, who's been cyberbullied all over Instagram. And so one of the things that he specifically mentions, because you probably thinking, if you're listening to this, exactly what I think, which is, so log off and just go back to real life. One of the things he mentions is that despite having a wide network of friends online, Emma felt increasingly isolated, constantly comparing herself to the idealized image she saw on her feed. And so one of the things that he mentions that I think is so profound and so powerful is that for so many people in the next generation, so as Gene Twenge would mention, like the iGen generation, the people who've grown up with social media and iPhones all their lives, is that for many of them, real life has become a virtual life where the real work that's done, the real currency that's won, the real relationships that are had are not flesh and blood. They're not right here. They're online. And that can be gaming, that can be social media, it can be a number of different things, but that becomes the real world.
Right.
And so the very thought of the loss of that, or when things are attacked, like that can devastate and depress, and it becomes something that's so powerful because a couple of things. One, you now open yourself up to really anyone can walk by and attack you, but you also put your identity out there and your values out there. So he has this great quote where he says, what we are seeing in this generation is not just a rise in anxiety. It's a fundamental shift in how they relate to the world. Social media has created a pressure cooker for comparison and perfectionism. And I think it's absolutely true. And
that's just not for teens.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
As I look at all your pictures and think, I didn't take pictures of my kids like that.
That's happening for all of us. I think
we're better equipped.
For your average adult, most of the identity formation has happened. Not to say that you still don't, try to form identity around groups as you get older, but this is their first experience with really formulating an identity outside of my immediate nuclear family.
Right.
And like Ben was saying, another word for this group is digital natives. I mean, and I think about my 5-year-old son picks up an iPad. He immediately knows what to do with it. I mean, they're growing up with this technology, and they're growing up this, like you said, is their world. And so when they're beginning, we were able to start that identity formation piece when it was more flesh and blood interaction. I think, Ben and I were talking before how even for us, it started to shift a little bit because the internet had come out. I know with Jason, when you were younger and they were still chiseling on stones, you had no choice but to do flesh and blood interaction. But maybe you sent carrier
to
pigeons.
get our dinner, flesh and blood interaction to get our dinner.
Messaging was carrier pigeons, but for this group, they're beginning their identity formation already living in this world. Because what does I think most social media platforms, it's age 13 to be able to set up an account. I mean, that's exactly when identity formation begins in the brain.
Yeah.
So it's like perfect timing, perfect storm.
And so we're kind of talking about the first of the three problems that Haidt highlights, or causes of the problem of the rise of depression.
Mm-hmm.
And he highlights social media, and we begun talking about that, but I think we need to say a little more about that. But then there's two more problems that we haven't even mentioned yet that cause this, and it's overprotection, or maybe they coined the word safetyism, that idea. And then thirdly, social or societal expectations and academic pressures. So interestingly, the rise of anxiety and depression in this group of people who are coming into their own as adults and as forming their own identities, social media is only one piece of the puzzle. Overprotection and then other pressures. What more do we need to say right here and think about right here to help friends and parents think through the role of social media in their kids' lives?
What do you think? I mean, you interact, as a youth pastor, it's kind of where you're squarely ministering majority of your time. What are you seeing?
I think every parent needs to also just know this, and you probably already do, because I think we see it, but we don't always want to believe it, is the idea that social media is not neutral. Like, it is a marketer, and it is an incredible one at that. And whether it's trying to intentionally or not, it often replaces a whole lot of very key things that are a part of our children's development. Community being one of them. Again, you can have the ease of an online community that you can give and you can take, you can grow into, or you can grow out of, that the second you don't like it anymore, you just leave it and you never have to pay the consequences for the things you've done or the things you've said. Like, it is a cheap community. And again, it's not neutral, because the reality is everyone on there has an agenda, and they're trying to grow their account. They're trying to sell you that product. And again, we think of agenda as always being bad. It's not. Like, not always, but we just need to go into it knowing that everyone has an agenda at some point. Again, one of the things that he mentions very specifically, and he uses the kind of the acronym that we have all heard by now, is called FOMO, right? That social media platforms are engineered to keep users engaged through algorithms that reward extreme emotions and highlight the most attention-grabbing content. That is why social media has continuously gotten more and more extreme. Just remember, we often think of, if you've ever tried to make social media content, you hear the great algorithm that is really supposed to be biased, and maybe it is, but there's actually a good amount of research on the algorithm, quote unquote, of Instagram and Facebook and all those things, that's really biased on simply the fact that you sent it out. The stuff that gets sent off platform gets highlighted. And so the stuff that intrigues you that much, that gives you such new information that you've never heard before, that you text it to a friend, that's the stuff that gets highlighted. So you're taking the extreme of the extreme that gets sent to be more and more extreme. And now that extreme of the extreme becomes ordinary because everybody's seen it. That is very dangerous. And again, it's not inherently bad, but we need to know what it is. And so that wouldn't be such a problem if our students weren't spending a pretty crazy, and not just our students, but also their parents and also me, but a pretty crazy amount of time on their screens each day. He references specifically that teens spend an average of 7 hours and 22 minutes on screens each day, which my first gut reaction is, well, they spend a lot of time on screens at school. That 7 hours and 22 minutes is excluding time spent on any homework.
Wow. It is
amazing.
Can hardly believe that. I can hardly figure out where those hours are.
Yeah. And we wonder what our students are doing, late at night. Like, we put them, send them to bed or whatever. It's like, when we send our kids to go to bed, like, if we don't take their phones from them, like, they are entering into a new world of communication. And again, that doesn't inherently have to be bad, but it comes with a lot of cons.
My mom always said nothing good happens after 10 at night.
And so again, it doesn't just always end up being students doing insidious things.
Yeah.
Like one of the things he references a lot is this idea of doom scrolling, the doom scrolling phenomenon where teens, like he uses a story of a girl named Alyssa who spends hours consuming negative news. It's more of what I was talking about, the extreme becoming common.
Yeah.
Comparing their lives to influencers and being exposed to online conflicts. Let me just be as authentic and real, and use a real life example that I've talked about with so many of our guys. So many of our guys have recently got into like lifting weights and working out. They tell me all about these social media influencers who are pretty objectively on some serious compounds, pharmaceuticals,
off-brand pharmaceuticals.
And that's their job to look that way. And they're making sacrifices that they think that they can get by going to the gym twice a week with no extra, nothing, no gear, nothing, none of that stuff. And then they get depressed because they don't look that way and they think that's the norm. And it's like, no. The extreme has become the norm. That to me is one of the major dangers of social media. The extreme moving in to become just like every other day.
Well, man, it's like you said, that's what it's designed to do.
Yeah.
And I think not only does it promote anxiety, but if you've got someone that's already prone to anxiety, it's almost like the system itself is dialed in to highlight the things that you focus on. And so if you're anxious all the time, it's going to pick up on that. And it's going, and again, it's not saying, I'm trying to make you anxious. What it's saying is, I'm trying to keep you on this platform.
Right. And
these are the things that grab your attention. And you watch these videos over and over and over. I'm going to keep feeding them to you. And so like you just said, if the things that get the most reaction are the things that are most emotional, most extraordinary. And the algorithm picks up on those, and those are the things you consistently see. So that becomes, oh, okay, well, everybody's doing this, or everybody thinks that, or it's only ever bad news. We're only, all we see is, war here or war there or threat of war there. Well, that's because negativity and drama attract people. And so those are the things we pay attention to. And to go back to talking about just the system itself, it's not neutral. It's a business platform. I heard somebody say one time, if something's free, it's because you're the product.
Yeah, you're the product.
And so, their goal is to keep you on this platform as long as possible. They've hired people to help them do that because it is a business. And like you said, it's not that we're not saying, it in and of itself is right or wrong. We're just saying, understand that there's an agenda behind it, and there's an intent behind it. And, for folks that are trying to sell things that are genuinely helpful, it's great. But there are also people up there who, we live in a fallen world. There are people on the internet, shocker, who have nefarious goals. And, I think one of the things they talk about is, especially when it comes to young women, is, you have people on the internet who want to take advantage of them. And if you're just letting your teenagers on the internet, I think he talked about, it's like throwing them in the Wild Wild West. You can't, we spend so much time trying to, and this might bleed us over into safetyism, but we spend so much time trying to protect physically, but then we act like this virtual world is, it's totally fine. I got to keep you, I can't let you play on the playground. I can't let you, do this, or I can't let you run off with your friends by yourself in the woods and go hiking together. I can't let you do that, but here's a cell phone and go for it.
Yeah, with unlimited access.
Yeah.
So let me say that, do you want to say something?
Well, I feel like my posture was, I was more suspicious of what my boys were watching than it turned out I needed to be. Now, we did keep the guards on to keep it careful for them, because you don't want to give temptation and so on and so forth. So phones in the kitchen early on, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And so instead of saying how our world is protective of and then give them, I think a lot of Christian parents are thinking, oh, these phones are always bad. Only bad stuff's out there. And also, like what you just said a minute ago, it's not inherently evil. It's not always insidious what they're looking at. And I needed that as well. So I know I'm not making a case for giving your kids more phone time. I'm just saying I was so worried about some of these things, not from Haidt, just from life, that I kind of was always afraid. Now, it made me pray more. But maybe there's more room for discovering what's good and beautiful out there. But it was never 10 o'clock, go to bed, but your phone's in your room with you. Like that just didn't happen in our house. Just absolutely not. Because I was so scared. Because we all know this. So it's not neutral. It is a marketing platform. It's not always insidious or inherently evil. And I think I needed to wrestle with that in a different way than what I hear you, Justin, saying of the safetyism, and yet we're giving kids phones, which I think you're right. The world is giving them phones way too early. I think as Christian parents, I actually had to work through it from the different angle. Mm-hmm. How can I let him use it? And I don't think we got it all right either.
Yeah. So I think to kind of sum this up before we move on to overprotection a little bit, and because I just want to make a statement that you'll agree with this, but might seem weird jumping into overprotection right afterwards. So two things. One, we just mentioned it, but two of the major dangers of social media is this. Number one, that the extreme becomes normal. I mean, if you've ever watched the Hunger Games, I don't mean the actual games, but if you can jump to the place where everyone's wearing the most extreme things, that is where our culture, like again, not culture in the sense of just dress, but like that's what social media can kind of create. It creates a monster in a way of just over ridiculousness in some things where the extreme has just become normal. Mm-hmm. And we kind of look at that and be like, who would ever wear that? It's like, but over enough time, nobody bats an eye at that.
Yeah.
And we've done that with news, and we've done that with content, and we've done that with so many other things. But number two is that I think this is a major danger, is that the private has become public. And so there are a lot of things in life that are private. The mistakes that you make, the weird, awkward situations in your life, moments that you wish you could take back. But the problem is our middle schoolers and high schoolers and so many others are growing up not in private, but in public.
Yeah.
And so the words that they say, the mistakes that they make are end up being not private ones, but public ones. And there are real consequences, and those run deeper. And I think that's a major reason why anxiety, depression, and suicide have happened. Because if that's where real life happens, then you try to live your life in that, and everyone who sees it, like only so many people saw me look like a goofball that day where I said that really dumb thing in class. And I don't live near any of them anymore.
Right.
Or all of the things that go with that. But when it goes online, it's like, it's there forever.
I was just saying, not only is it public, but it's permanent.
Yeah.
And all it takes is a screenshot, and
it's kind of like when I was growing up, the tabloids would make fun of the child stars in Hollywood, but now everyone's a child star because everything is being played out in public.
Yeah.
And so one of the problems that also goes with that, he uses this great illustration of like when the private becomes public, we also release things that people don't need to see and shouldn't see that now get to see it. He has this great illustration, and it's terrifying. As someone who has a 3-year-old daughter, like this one messed with me. It was, hey, if your daughter's room had a window that when she turned 13, strangers could walk by and just stop for a minute and watch her dance and watch her play with her toys and watch her talk to her friends, what would you do with the window? It was like, I would bar that thing. Like I would cover it with as much wood as anything that I could. Like I'm not letting anyone out. And he goes, yeah, because that's social media.
Yeah.
And it's like, is that extreme? Yes. Is that real? Yes. And we need that kind of a little bit of when we're willing to give that over to our kids. Good. So I'm 100% on board with, and that's his own illustration. And so I'm on board for the second point. But just as you were mentioning, his idea of overprotection, which we're about to get into, is we overprotect in the real, but underprotect in the virtual.
Yeah.
So point number two is what? Is
overprotection. Safetyism.
And as he talks about safetyism. And so I think he has a great kind of idea of what this is. He says, overprotection, particularly in affluent communities, has led to the phenomenon of safetyism, where children are shielded from all potential risks, physical, emotional, and intellectual. This stifles their ability to develop resilience and face challenges. I'll be honest, I was much meaner on this until I had children. And then I was like, I just want to protect them from everything. Like that heart and that desire is a good thing. And so if you're a parent and you hear that and you're like, but I just want to love my children, like I get that. And that he's not saying don't do that. Yeah. Part of protecting our children and doing that well is loving them well, right? But protecting them from everything ultimately hurts them. he actually he coined this incredible phrase in The Calling of the American Mind, which we can go back to and listen to that podcast as well. It's well worth the time, where he basically boils it down to really an option. Do we, you want to say it?
Well, if I don't blow it,
well,
do we prepare the road for the child, or do we prepare the child for the road?
Yeah, and that's the major battle that we all have, because, well, of course we want strong, resilient children, but we also don't want to see them get hurt.
Yeah.
And there's this major place of contention right there. And he boils it down to this incredible place that in that kind of aphorism idea that we've all heard of preparing the road for the child or the child for the road. He's like, look, it is for the younger years, it is absolutely easier because, look, parents, we're tired, right? We want easy. It's absolutely easier to bulldoze everything. It's easier on you and it's easier on them. There's less messes, less stuff to fix. But it will create some catastrophes if we do that for too long and in too many ways, because now we end up with weak kids who can't really go through anything. And so I found a lot of help in this chapter as I was trying to reading it and struggling it, especially because he tells this really cool story of a guy of a namesake of mine, Ben. I think he was just talking about me. I think this is the story that I wrote in. Yeah. A 13-year-old boy who has never walked to school by himself or played unsupervised. When Ben finally attended a summer camp without constant adult supervision, which he talks about in the stories, like the parents were super reluctant to do, he initially felt anxious, but later thrived, gaining confidence and independence. That often the thing that's like, I don't know if I can let him do. I don't know, like that becomes the thing that empowers them and grows them. Like that resilience, it grows and it needs to be tested. It needs to be built.
Well, and I mean, to your point earlier, it's a balance. I mean, we're called by God to protect our children, to shepherd them, to disciple them. But part of that is allowing them to experience difficulty. Because his quote of, children are like muscles, they grow stronger when they experience stress and challenges. Overprotection may feel like love, but it's depriving them of the resilience they need to thrive. Like we were talking about this before. There's this balance of we need difficulty, but we don't want to break our kids. And so we want them to experience some challenges. We want them to develop a little bit of resilience, because if they don't, they're already prone towards anxiety because they're in constant protection mode and defend mode. And so they're already prone towards anxiety. And then they get into this virtual world where they don't know how to handle somebody saying something difficult. They don't know how to handle a criticism because they've been shielded from that. So not only they're already kind of prone for anxiety, but now they're in an environment that really picks at that. But to your point earlier, it is a balance, because even Haidt would say it, like there's some good things in social media. Like the internet is not all bad.
No, right.
And I'd venture to say it's not going anywhere. And so you've got to train them
till the next Stone Age.
Yeah, that's right. Until the big grid collapse. But it's not going anywhere in the sense that it's really become a part of our culture and a part of our society. So you can't shield them from it totally. But I think his question would be, now that the data is in, are we doing the right? Are we introducing it to them in the right way? Have we put the right safeguards in place? What can parents be thinking about as they're thinking about, or is it launching their child into the virtual space? It comes down to a balance. Like you were saying, I want to protect my kids, but at a certain point, I've got to also allow them to experience difficulty, because that's going to help them when they get into this virtual space of being able to balance, okay, this is what I do if somebody just makes an offhand dumb comment. This is how I handle a stupid mistake that everybody saw. How do I recover from that? How do I remain resilient, emotional capacity, all those kind of things?
It seems like, in general, so out of the social media sphere, I think it's true that children who have been overprotected, parents who are overprotective of their children, there's more opportunities for kids to see the world as a dangerous place. There's more reason for them to develop anxieties about stuff others who engage it don't have to, because they're already in it.
If I look at my primary caregivers and they're deathly afraid of the world and trying to protect it from me, then it must be bad.
Yeah. So
And I think it makes sense because if you think about it, like if you're a kid who's never grown up outside, if you go out into the woods, if you go out to really wherever it is, I mean, it's kind of like if you go to the beach. If you've grown up going to the beach, you look at the ocean, you look at the sand, and what do you think? You think of great memories and fun of times that you had out there, and you're like, oh, that brings me joy. I can look at that absolutely chaotic place that is the beach.
Yeah, it
and
is.
You look at it with joy and excitement because that's your reference point. Like the same is true. I mean, like from that, but like if you're someone who's grown up, I mean, but if you're not someone who's grown up with that, you look at it for maybe what it really is, but you see the chaos and you have no other reference point, but just currently where you are, which is great when you're 3. When I take my daughter to the beach, or when she was 1, I take her to the beach for the first time, and she's like loud and very violent. Welcome to the eastern, coast beaches. But that's going to be really bad when she's 21. And I protected her from everything. And it's like that one-off mean comment sets her into a tailspin.
Yeah.
Because she can't handle that. And again, like those analogies can mix a bit, but I think we get the idea.
Well, I'd be interested to know, Ben, from your perspective, because one thing I think about when we think about boundaries and these, protecting kids, one thing that, I mean, we've all been teenagers before. One thing that teenagers love to do is do the very thing that our parents are like deathly afraid of, or do the very thing they're like, hey, don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're thinking about, parents that are maybe listening to this or reading this book, like what do you feel like that makes it all the more important to have solid conversations with your teenager about not just, hey, here's the boundary, but the why behind the boundary, like to have those, like it's not that I'm afraid of what you could experience out there, but I'm trying to be realistic.
Yeah. We did a podcast not too long ago with Susan as well. She kind of walked through the different stages of parenting. And I forget the exact stage name. You'll have to forgive me, everybody. You can go listen to it. I'll go back and listen to it too. And you kind of eventually hit into the stage where, early on, you don't explain why, because it's just this, thus says mom and dad. But eventually, the why behind it might be more important than the what that leads it or that's in front of it, because they get to understand not just why you came to that, but or what they have to do, but how did mom and dad who loves me get to that point, who are not perfect and may have missed something, don't understand this, but why do they get there? And so I think explaining to your kids, at least at a certain age, I don't know exactly when that is is extremely helpful. I just recently had a story. We just recently had this where a parent a mom and dad who, I mean, they are awesome and they love their children. And one of their kids wanted to change, a major piece of their life, of kind of the ways that they always saw what their kid was going to do. And they prayed about it, they saw it, and they were wrestled with it for years. And eventually we're going to try to meet them and explained it. And then they actually met in the middle, and they're like, hey, look, we're not going to go all the way to yours, but you don't have to go all the way to ours.
You've informed ours.
Yeah.
That's the key.
They had a helpful conversation that ultimately I think was exactly what Jesus wanted to get them to. And I think the other side is exactly what I just meant, is I think it's also helpful to go into every conversation with your kids knowing you're not in it alone. You also have the Holy Spirit to also guide you with you. Yeah. Right. I mean, to bring in a little Jesus somewhere, probably 40 minutes into this.
So the other thing in overprotection or safetyism is, on the one hand, we want to shield our kids from potential risks and so on and so forth. But resilience comes as they see they can risk themselves and thrive or recover from a disaster. And that's a great thing. The other thing, as they get older, I think, well, all the way through, but also as they get older, we want perfect kids. But home has to be a safe place to fail. We can't protect them from making every mistake as teenagers, as preteens, and a little bit younger. But the more freedom they have, the more we as parents have to be ready not to have safetyism, overprotection as our operating system. Because if we want them in a few years to move out of our house, we have to teach them what love and consequences and risk and your choices and all of that rolled in together, and still we're in relationships. So that's just, and I say that as, we had to learn that. I had to learn that because I wasn't going to have perfect kids. It became clear. And so as Jimbo and Joan kind of coached us along the way, but it's a safe place to fail. This is, and others, many others, but this was one of the helpers for me overcoming my overprotectionism. All right, what's cause number 3 of the rise in anxiety as Haidt lays it out here?
So yeah, cause number 3 is is, believe it or not, one of my favorite ones. It's called academic pressure and societal expectations. Before we jump into that, I'll just be honest. Like, I think we've probably all at some point looked at a middle school student or a high school student and go, but all you do is just go to school. That's all you do. If you've ever thought that, I get that, because they don't have jobs. They don't have, like, all those many they're not paying bills. Like, they don't have all that on them, right? But I will be honest, even though I've thought that and I felt that at times, it is one of the more frustrating things for me when parents will say that, or other people will say that, because I think we forget, and this is one of the things that he's going to highlight, is that this is the very first time they've ever had to do these things, be in this situation, and have real consequences with it. Like, when you enter them into middle school, like, or if you're a third grade boy and you burp or fart in class, it's hilarious, and you're like, this is great. If you do that, no. If you do that 6th, 7th, 8th grade, when you just notice the girls that are in the class, you're mortified. Yeah. Like, it's a new world that they're entering into, and we just need to know. Like, and there become real consequences. Again, like, we jumping back to a little while ago, where it's like, now if you add that to the online world where you're still figuring out life, and yet you have to pay big consequences and long-term consequences when that video gets pulled up again from 10 years ago. Like, no wonder we're scared. No wonder we get depressed, because so much is on the line. And I don't think we often think of it that way, because all you do is go to school.
You think about, I mean, very good. Like you just said, there are things 10, 15 years ago that I have said or written that I'm like, man, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have said it that way, or I wouldn't have written that, or I think completely differently now. The problem is that 10, 15 years ago, Justin still lives in a corner of the virtual world somewhere. I mean, you see that with a lot of our celebrity figures, even political figures. I mean, how often do they dig up a video or a picture from someone's college experience 30 years ago and use it? And it's like that wasn't even, the internet didn't exist then. And now you've got it where, again, a screenshot and a text message, and what you intended for one person can now be seen by 300 people.
It's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, I was just listening to an interview with a very famous comedian who got hired on one day for SNL, and then everybody freaked out, and they came up with clips from the first podcast he'd ever done where he said some raunchy things, because he's a comedian. They sometimes do that, and he got immediately let go. Because, like, it was like, that got filmed and it got taken out of context. And that's, I think, a major point, is like, it can be brought in from whenever, for whatever, and it doesn't have to be in context. That clip can speak. And if you ever have to do but that's not what I meant, you've already lost.
Yeah.
And so it's the very first time they've ever had to deal with this stuff with real consequences. And then one of the other things I often mention to our parents as well, and to whoever that will listen to me, right, is that they're also building a bit on moving and shifting sand and what I mean by that is they have an unset and their identity hasn't quite formed yet. I mean, just, you were mentioning identity not too long ago, is when you're in middle school and high school, you don't know who you are yet. And you haven't built the relational capital to help define who you are. Like, there's just something about it now. If I have a middle school girl who makes a slightly mean comment, they would never, of course, but they say a slightly mean comment, it's okay. You know why? Because I know that when I go home, I have a wife of 8 years who loves me, and probably loves me even for that thing that I just got made fun of. And I've got 2 kids who do. Oh, and I have a job now. Oh, and I have a resume of successes, and a probably slightly longer resume of failures, but that's okay too.
You recovered
we've
from.
Figured out, yeah. And so they don't have that background or that foundation to kind of bounce everything off of. And so it's like everything that's going on with, now you have more things that can critique you, and it pierces deeper, and they have less to have it bounce off of them with. Like, this is a very tumultuous time. Middle school, high school, even in college, like, it is a game changer. And so I take it very seriously with our students. Like, the world that they're living in is not necessarily the safest, and it's not the easiest for sure. Which is what Haidt argues really here, that today's youth are burdened by, and I love this, unprecedented academic expectations. and that they're told from a young age that success in school is directly tied to future success in life, creating a constant sense of stress and competition. We've all probably heard that or felt that at some point. If you'll just get good grades, then you've got it, and then you'll get in, and then you won't become a insert that occupation that we all think is really bad, that we don't want to have our kids become.
Pastor.
Yeah, or whatever, right? And half the time they're usually making 5 times the amount of money that what you probably will end up becoming. But that's just funny to me. And so the pressures become so serious because here's what I think is interesting. Like when we think of academic pressure, I bet at one point, like when the vast majority of people only made it through middle school, like where was the academic pressure on that part? It's probably just get through it, like just make it,
right,
or just make it through high school. But now we've gotten it, into advanced degrees, into terminal degrees, on and on and on. That the level of success academically is like, well, if you don't have a PhD, if you don't have a master's, you're not even going to get a job.
Yeah.
And so grades become so much more serious about that. And then they've also gone lower and lower and lower because each one of them's connected. Right. Well, if you want to get into the middle school, that'll get you into the high school, that'll get you into college, that'll get you into the advanced degree program, then you've really got to get an A in Math 1 in kindergarten or whatever it is. It's like,
right.
Yeah, it always creeps. I mean, and I saw that. I mean, spending a decade or more in higher education, we saw that. I mean, you'd start with, you'd have classes or remedial classes for folks getting into college to kind of catch them up in math and English. Well, then it came out, well, let's do an early high school, or early college high school, which again, is not a bad thing, but it starts to creep back. And then it becomes, well, can we start prepping them in middle school for early college high school? And it's like, okay, well, once we start doing that, well, where does it keep moving back to?
Yeah.
Because the other thing we're telling students is the decisions you make right now, while it might not be what we're overtly saying, the image we're giving is the decisions you're making right now are irredeemable. And so if you don't do well right now, you'll never be successful. Mm-hmm. When in all actuality, you might mess up now, but with time, you can overcome that poor grade. You might have to repeat anatomy and physiology 2 or 3 times. That's what the course is designed for. It's designed to weed people out. But we give this kind of narrative to what you were talking about earlier of if you don't do well here, then your future's shot. And so it becomes so focused on, you don't even get to be a kid anymore, because it now becomes, I've got to do really, really well on my 9th grade, algebra test, because I want to get into XYZ college one day, and they're going to start looking at this.
Yeah.
So almost like not only do you have the opportunity to make a mistake, but it's irredeemable if you do.
Yeah.
As I read this part of your notes, I thought of what I grew up with, let's say in the 80s, early 90s. I thought of what we were hearing about Japan and South Korea, where kids would study all weekend, study all night, commit suicide if they didn't think they got a good end of high school grade, because they would all do an end of high school grade. And we all, back in the 80s, thought, not kids per se, but as a culture, we thought, oh, isn't that so sad on these kids? So much pressure, so young. And it seems like it's creeping here. It's here, and we just went through college applications, and it's hard. I mean, you got to differentiate yourself from all the other people applying to your college, and you got to make all these extracurricular things. Like, we've only talked about grades, but how about leadership roles and extracurricular and what counts and what doesn't? And are you in the National Honor Society? And are you in this? And it's so much noise.
Well, it's almost this idea that you kind of like, I think you used a phrase earlier today in a different meeting we were in, you have to train to train. And it's almost like college is no longer about forming you in the liberal arts or whatever, your way of thinking and your ability to creatively think. It's now about, all right, you already got to be there, and we'll take you from there and move you forward. So in a sense, if you aren't already operating as a standout person, then forget it. So I almost have to prove my worth to even attend college, not alone when I get there, have to then keep that up.
So maybe you're listening to this right now and you're like, well, it's probably not that bad, right? He has these pretty incredible and mind-blowing statistics where he says how the 2019 American Psychological Association survey found that 83% of teens said that school was a significant source of stress. It's like, okay, maybe. That suicide rates among college students have increased by nearly 40% over the past few decades, past decade. There's this great idea that Jonathan Haidt, I listened to another podcast at one point where he mentioned this, where he says that many people have wrongly assumed that suicide is a disease of the poor and foolish. But the last few decades have shown us it is a luxury, and he means that a little sarcastically, the luxury of the smart and wealthy. It's one of the reasons why Harvard, believe it or not, has one of the highest suicide rates of any college. Because one of the things that he mentions, he says this in the book, that we've conditioned an entire generation to believe that their worth is tied to their academic performance. I'd be willing to bet so many of our listeners feel that this pressure coupled with the uncertainties of the future job market creates an unsustainable mental load. So now think of this as just as compounding terrible debt of social media that's breaking down your own identity and value in yourself. Then now you've been protected and you have a razor thin level of armor to protect yourself from everything. And now an even greater burden and load to carry academically that also is about your identity and your future worth and your current worth. And it's like, no wonder this book needed to be written, and that we have a generation of kids that are anxious, that are struggling with depression and suicide. We have created, and he talks about this a good bit, like a perfect storm here. And here's, I think, the great evil of it is because it was all done by trying to do good things for our kids. That's the problem. Is none of these were like, no one sat down with an agenda of like, how do we take advantage of our kids? It's not a cabal. It was parents going like, well, I mean, it's social media. It gives them more access. It'll give them something to do. This is good. It's more access online with more information. This is a good thing. I get that. I mean, you think about like, well, I don't want them to have to struggle and have all these broken bones and bruises. And I don't want them to have traumas and wounds. So I'm going to bulldoze everything and take care of them. I get that. And then lastly, I mean, right here of just, I want to see my kids succeed and I'm going to push them. And I get that too with all these expectations. But the unforeseen consequences have created a perfect storm. And that's what the book is about.
But he doesn't leave it there on the perfect storm. He and then we can say, here are some helps. Here is a pathway forward. I think he would say, what are the four things maybe that he encourages us as some takeaways to work towards as you kind of summarize them?
Yeah. So the very first one is, he gives us four, and that the very first one is that we need to help build resilience in our kids. We mentioned it earlier, but there was this idea, like at point number 2, of overprotection and safetyism. He mentions the opposite of overprotection and safetyism is not just, making fairly resilient kids, but helping them be anti-fragile. Justin, you had mentioned it, that how he kind of makes this idea of kids are like muscles. And he also uses the reference of they're also like bones. The beautiful thing about bones is when they're broken, that's never quite a good thing. Usually it is, yes, there's trauma and yes, there's brokenness, right? But when it's healed and when it's set in a good and right way, the place that it's set, it actually becomes stronger. One of the other places that we mentioned even today was it's kind of like, hey, this new table, the place that it's glued together, those bonds, like where it was broken, like those are the strongest points of this entire table. And so it's the great reminder that little like managed brokenness and managed like wounds at times, because they're natural and they're going to happen, when they're managed and dealt with well and given time to heal, can create some of the strongest places of who we are. And so he talks about building resilience. And so Haidt stresses the importance of letting children face challenges and encourages a growth mindset where failures are seen as learning opportunities. This particularly for me has been one of the most game-changing things. It was one of the things that my dad set in me, was that every opportunity that you fail is not an indictment, but an opportunity, right? And I still struggle with that because I want to jump to indictment. Oh, I'm terrible. I want no. No, this is an opportunity to grow into who you could be. And so he gives us a couple examples. He says, encourage parents to allow kids to walk to school. Now that might be hard where we are.
Right.
Absolutely. And so these are all, again, you can't, every time you give an example, it's not going to be true and holistic for everyone, right? To handle disagreements with peers on their own. I love this one. I just talked with a parent as we've had a couple of kids in our student ministry who believe this or not, had some relational drama. Shocker. And the parents were getting involved and kind of bulldozing everything and solving it for them. Just like, oh, you like, and I was talking to another parent who was like, yeah, my wife and I, we just kind of decided, and this is a parent who has kids who are well off into college and married now, was like, we just decided a long time ago that we were only going to get into the mess after a certain point. And we wanted to help them figure it out. We would walk alongside them, but we weren't going to get involved with the other parents until a certain point. It's like, if you get engaged, we're in.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe before that, we're gonna be hands off. That may not be where you are as a listener, but it's helpful a metric to kind of look at and be like, oh, there are different places and different levels of involvement that you can get into.
Well, and it's back to the different postures of parenting that we talked about earlier with Susan. Discipline early, training, and then coaching in the teenage years. And you're on the sidelines of their lives. You're not in the middle of it.
Yeah. And I think another one, a really big one, is, and he ends up kind of talking more about this at actually point number 4, but let your kids go play outside more. And we'll touch that one in a minute. Mm-hmm. But also is let them have a job and give them a job. I think.
So this builds resilience.
Yeah. Because
all
specific, I mean, like, we probably all have a story, of kids going off and having college because they have disagreements that are not with mom and dad, but with boss who holds all the power that will fire you, who also cuts your checks. Like, that's a different relationship, and you have to handle that differently, as well as with coworkers. And so maybe your kid is not ready to have a job, but they are most likely ready to go serve in a ministry at their church or be involved in some community, like some aspect of their community that they can help out and have to figure out some things as well. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add in building resilience too is I think this is a real opportunity to start. We're talking about identity formation.
Yeah.
Here, with that growth mindset, helping kids understand part of the glory of the gospel is that nothing is irredeemable. And so as you inherently make mistakes because you are a human being and you live in a fallen world, pointing them back to, regardless of what you do, it is because of what Jesus has done, nothing is irredeemable. And yes, it might take some work and it might change things, but mistakes and difficulty are not something that God does not walk with us through. I can't talk today. But I think that, and particularly in this spot of building that resilience, because part of that growth mindset is that thought pattern. And so when I do fall short, when I do stumble, when I do make a mistake, what's the first thought that pops in my head? Training our children and even ourselves for the first thought to not be, oh, I'm a failure, or I'm awful. This just proves that I can't do whatever this is, or that I'm not worth anything. But pointing it back to, oh man, thank you, Lord, that you make beauty out of ashes, and thank you that you take things that are broken and you restore them. And so while this might be hard for me to walk through and it might be difficult, it's not the end of my story.
Yeah.
Good.
One of the things he says, lastly, just to end on this point, where he says, children need to experience controlled stress in order to grow. Stress is inevitable, but we can kind of decide how much stress to give our children now. And I think that's invaluably important, right? Because they eventually will get all the stress of the world. We get to help slowly train them. And I get how hard this is. As a parent, like I almost sometimes hate taking my children to the playground because they have to deal with other kids that don't see the world like we do, don't play nicely. And I think my kids are the best kids in the whole world. And I'm like, but I have to fight that temptation all the time. Now, that gets harder in middle school and then in high school. But
they're bigger and stronger.
This is training.
Like, it's not a 3-year-old in high school.
And I think the reminder here is we, as parents, we need as much training in this as our kids do, and letting it over as well. Go. I sure do. Okay, so that was number 1. Number 2 is limiting social media. We'll get to the new norms and the new rules here in a minute. But he talks
Haidt suggests.
that Haidt suggests. But the whole idea of limiting social media use, he says, delaying the introduction of social media until age 16, as Haidt suggests, can significantly reduce feelings of anxiety because he emphasizes face-to-face interactions and encourages parents to enforce boundaries around phone use. Parents, we've all heard stories of kids and we've seen them, and it might be ours. And the great thing, just as you were saying, Justin, is if that is our kid, this is redeemable too. We've all have stories or seen the kids who struggle to talk to anyone face to face. And my 1-year-old and 3-year-old, they're in that boat. I just hope they're not in that boat, and I'm going to do my best to make sure they're not in that boat at 13, at 14, at 15. And I hope to, at least. And so one of the examples he gives is a pilot program in a school district that banned smartphones for students that were the students that found that they were more engaged in class, more sociable, and reported lower levels of stress because they weren't filled with all of the anxieties and all of the social media stuff that just goes on, but they're able to just kind of be where they are. It's hard enough. One of the biggest cons that we all talk about as adults is having to spin so many plates, relational, responsibilities, job stuff, all of it. When students have to do life online and in real life, and they matter just as much and they're equal, that's a lot of plates they have to keep spinning. And I think we just need to remember that kind of stuff. So it's a helpful thing to limit that for them.
So he's suggesting less anxiety the farther out you push the initiation of social media.
Yeah.
And then the third one, which he's kind of alluded to in your pilot program, is that he says we should have phone-free schools.
Yeah.
I think every teacher in the world would say that too.
It's true.
I think there's not we don't even have to talk about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Phone-free homeschools.
Yeah.
And then what about the fourth one?
Yeah, I'm a pretty big advocate of this one, and I throw my kids outside for some quiet time. But he talked. Number 4 is encouraging independence and play. So encourage unstructured playtime and let children take risks. One of the things that I do see it a lot is like some like I've had to wrestle with this. Some of our students is if you don't tell them exactly what to do and what the boundaries are, they don't always know what to do. And it's like we thrive in boundaries, and that's a good thing. The classic examples where they, hate to compare our children to livestock, but like where they put cows in an unguarded, unfenced in yard, and they only make it so far out because they sense danger. But then they set fences 3-4 times as far out, and the cows go all the way out to the fences. It's like helping give structure is helpful and it builds. But we also need to give them time where they can set a bit of the rules, right? Within those boundaries. Like right now, and this is small potatoes for some of you parents who have kids in middle school and high school, but my 3-year-old, like we have a fenced in backyard. I know she can't get out too far out of that. And so we'll give her a freedom to figure out games and to play out there and to have some independence and play. What does that look like in middle school and high school? A lot of it is still giving rules of I need you back at this time and you can't be around these people but I'm going to let you go to places that I can't control the situations in, where I don't necessarily know who you're around and what's going to go on, and trusting them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I grew up in a home where my mom always was raising adults. So she never ironed for me. She showed me how to iron. We did not have school cafeterias in elementary school or anything, or high school. So she showed me what to make for lunch. So there I am in 5th grade making my own lunch if I wanted to eat. And that was just her thing. Well, you're going to have to live in the world. Let me help you. And she was a great mom, and we had a lot of fun, and she bought us a lot of things. And, like all the mom things, like chocolate chip cookies after school, she'd have made for us at times. But the whole idea is that she wasn't raising kids. She was raising adults. We had to talk like adults and then start acting like them and get the clobber on the head when we didn't act like adults. So yes, that independent, and she had 5 kids, so she couldn't watch us all the time. So there was a lot of vigilante justice in the rec room. But you learn a little resilience and when to tell on someone and when not to.
Yeah.
Okay, so Haidt closes, or he kind of suggests now again, as Justin indicated at the beginning, he's not coming from a Christian perspective. I actually don't know his faith journey, but he's not publishing in a Christian publishing house. He is working at NYU. He is offering this to the world. So there's no scripture behind things, but he comes up with 4 new norms that he calls it, or 4 rules that he says, if we instituted these society-wide, it would help us all the way right now. No smartphones before high school.
Amen.
No social media before age 16, which we just remembered. 4 phone-free schools. That's the third one. So he's really focused on that as the driver of anxiety and depression. And that's what he's solving, by the way. He's addressing anxiety. And then the last one is what we've just kind of talked about, resilience and free play, but more independence, more play, more responsibility in the real world. I would have put that one first. But I guess the first 3, no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools, they're just measurable, easy, short, and pithy.
And I think one thing he mentions is that if we would enact those 4 things, he argues that within a matter of years, we would see a turnaround in the mental health of teenagers.
I agree.
So,
I mean,
it's
intuitively, I agree.
Yeah, it's not one of those things where if you do these 4 things, in a generation from now, he's like, no, within years, we'll start to see a turn.
So why don't we enact these things? My thought is because parents also suffer from peer pressure.
Oh yeah.
That's my thought.
I think parents,
I don't want my kid to be the only one without a smartphone.
Parents also suffer from peer pressure, and we talked about this a little beginning, but this is, I think, highlighted in the life of teenagers, but adults aren't immune to these very things either.
That's true too.
We're experiencing, we're getting drawn into social media, so it's hard because not only we're thinking I need to do this for my kids, but there might be in the back of my head, well, goodness, I need to do this too. And so it's, and having, 2 really young boys, 5 and 2, I'll be the first one to say it's really easy to throw them in front of the TV or throw them in front of an iPad so I can get something done. I know that will keep their attention, or on a road trip that will stop the incessant questions for a 3-hour drive.
Or at least for half an hour of the 3-hour drive. Like these things aren't sinful. However, the helpful thing about putting on your kid's favorite TV show is that you got 29 minutes, and that the scary thing about putting a phone in front of a 12-year-old without any filters is that who knows where they get.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the difference. I'm trying not to make you feel too bad as a dad.
No. But I think that's the thing, is that we're also wrestling with what do we do with this, and so I'd venture to say part of our difficulty in how to handle this with our kids is we're still trying to figure out what do we do with social media. I mean, we're seeing echo chambers in our own lives. We're seeing, the thing we're wrestling with anxiety because we're seeing curated lives of our friends.
Well, mom and dad, we've done the hard work of doing the reading, and by we, I mean not me, of reading this 500-page book, and it was very helpful for me to banter with these guys. However, grandmas and grandpas, moms and dads, teenagers listening to this, it's now up to each one of us, like Justin was just saying, to figure out what we're going to do. Now, we may like Haidt's idea of no smartphones before high school and all that kind of stuff. But for sure, each one of us has to figure this out for ourselves and go ahead and talk it out with some friends. You see, there's wisdom in the body of believers. And when I know what Justin and Ben are doing, it helps me want to do similar things, or we form each other. And now the 3 of us have a little bit of a center of gravity to move forward in a course of action or to try something. Figure it out. Try, work. We're wiring our kids. We're helping our kids live in the world that's real. And so the more we can help them live in the world that's real, that's really out there, and the virtual world is part of the real world because it's really out there. How do we do that best? How do we follow the Lord in their lives? How do we help them follow the Lord in the world? That's where God's leading us, and that's where you're leading your kids, and we're all leading our societies. Teachers, parents, we're so thankful for you. And anything else to say here?
I'm good.
In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah. If you got questions, reach out to Ben.
Ben's the expert. So thank you for joining us on the supersized version of Encounter Grace. This is good. This is helpful. Go back and listen again. Pull out a couple of things you didn't hear last time. Share it with a friend, and we'll see you next time.